The night of October 11, 1307, descended over the Atlantic port of La Rochelle, like a shroud drawn across the face of history. Along the quays where Templar galleys had loaded wine and pilgrims for generations, shadows moved with purpose through the fog rolling in from the Bay of Biscay. According to records that would later surface in fragmentary form across European archives, 18 vessels bearing the Crimson Cross of the Knights Templar slipped their moorings between midnight and dawn, their holds heavy with cargo no manifest would ever document. 2 nights hence, at first light on Friday the 13th, royal agents bearing sealed orders from King Philip IV of France would burst through the gates of Templar preceptories across the kingdom. They would find Jacques de Molay, Grand Master of the Order, at morning prayers in the Paris Temple. They would seize knights still in their beds, sergeants at their duties, chaplains celebrating Mass. Nearly 2,000 arrests would be executed with mechanical precision across France in a single coordinated strike. But at La Rochelle, the Templar fleet was already gone. Medieval chronicles preserve fragments of what transpired in those final hours. A serving brother named Jean de Chalon would later testify under torture that Gérard de Villiers, preceptor of France, had departed Paris with 50 horses in the days before the arrests, moving through autumn darkness toward the Atlantic coast. The cargo he carried was described only as the whole treasury of Brother Hugues de Perrot. What form this treasure took, no document would ever specify. Gold and jewels were the least of what the Templars possessed after 2 centuries of accumulation. They held relics brought from Jerusalem, documents retrieved from beneath the Temple Mount, maps and charts accumulated across their Mediterranean empire, and knowledge that made kings nervous. The galleys that departed La Rochelle were not the sleek warships of legend, but working vessels adapted for the Order's commercial operations. Medieval shipping records indicate Templar ships were typically caravels of 40 to 60 tons, built with the flush planking and lateen rigging of Mediterranean tradition, but modified for Atlantic conditions. They were deep-hulled enough to carry cargo, shallow-drafted enough to navigate river mouths and tidal harbors, and equipped with both sail and oar for flexibility in contrary winds. Their crews numbered 20 to 30 men each, knights, sergeants, sailors hired from the coastal towns, and passengers whose identities went unrecorded. Autumn in the Atlantic approaches of Europe brings storms that can scatter fleets and drive ships onto lee shores with terrifying speed. The Bay of Biscay in October is particularly treacherous, with swells building to 30 feet and winds backing unpredictably between south and west. For ships departing in darkness, without the option of waiting for favorable conditions, the passage north would test every skill their navigators possessed. Yet the Templars had sailed these waters for generations. Their wine trade with England and their transport of pilgrims to Iberian ports had given them intimate knowledge of Atlantic currents, seasonal winds, and the harbors of refuge that dotted the coasts of Brittany, Cornwall, Wales, and beyond. Where the fleet was bound, the scattered testimonies would never conclusively establish. Some witnesses claimed Scotland, others mentioned Portugal. A few spoke of remote islands in the Western Ocean whose names appeared on no Christian maps. What is documented is that the Templar fleet vanished from European waters as completely as if it had sailed off the edge of the medieval world. When Philip's agents finally reached La Rochelle days after the arrests, they found only empty berths and a harbor master who claimed ignorance of any unusual departures. As dawn broke on October 13th, 1307, and the first Templars were dragged before inquisitors who would extract confessions through methods that broke men's bodies and spirits alike, 18 ships were already days gone, their sails filled with autumn wind, their prows pointed toward horizons where Philip's authority could not reach. The navigation charts they carried, the knowledge encoded in their captains' memories, and the secrets locked in iron-bound chests in their holds would become the most sought-after mystery of the medieval age. Behind them, France began to burn with the fires of manufactured heresy. Ahead, in the darkness before dawn, lay Scotland and survival. To comprehend the significance of the Templar flight, one must first understand what the Knights Templar had become by 1307. The order, founded in 1119 by 9 French knights sworn to protect pilgrims in the Holy Land, had evolved into something unprecedented in medieval Christendom, a transnational military-religious corporation that answered only to the Pope, commanded fortresses from the Mediterranean to the Baltic, and wielded financial power exceeding most kingdoms. Pope Innocent II's bull of 1139 had granted them extraordinary privileges: exemption from all local taxes and laws, the right to cross any border without hindrance, and spiritual authority subordinate to none save Rome itself. Their maritime operations were less celebrated than their military exploits, but no less sophisticated. The Templars maintained vessels at key ports throughout their domain: La Rochelle on the Atlantic, Marseille in the Mediterranean, Barcelona in Catalonia, and smaller stations at coastal preceptories from Portugal to the Baltic. These were not mere transport vessels, but elements of a commercial empire that moved wine, wool, grain, pilgrims, crusaders, and specie across the known world. Modern analysis of surviving port records reveals that Templar ships made regular runs between France and England, carrying cargoes that generated enormous revenues. The wine trade alone brought fortunes that allowed the order to function as banker to kingdoms. More significantly, for what would unfold in October 1307, the Templars possessed navigational knowledge accumulated over 2 centuries of operation in the Mediterranean and Atlantic. Their pilots had sailed routes that ordinary merchants avoided, their charts marked hazards and harbors unknown to rivals, and their captains understood currents, wind patterns, and celestial navigation techniques refined through constant practice. When Templar galleys transported crusading armies from Marseille to Acre, when they moved treasury shipments between commanderies, when they evacuated personnel from falling fortresses in the Holy Land, they demonstrated capabilities that made them the era's premier maritime organization. Yet this very success created vulnerabilities. By 1307, King Philip IV of France owed the Templars sums he could not repay. The order's independence grated on monarchs who sought absolute authority within their realms. Their military reputation had been tarnished by the fall of Acre in 1291, leaving them without clear purpose. Most dangerously, their wealth and secrecy spawned rumors that Philip's ministers would exploit with devastating effectiveness. The charges assembled against them, heresy, blasphemy, denial of Christ, worship of idols, were calculated to ensure that no Christian monarch could defend them without appearing complicit in their supposed crimes. The timeline of the arrests reveals meticulous planning. Philip's sealed orders dated September 14th were distributed to royal agents across France, with instructions that they remain unopened until October 12th. This secrecy was intended to prevent warning from reaching the Templars. Yet warning did reach them. Multiple sources suggest that by late September, key Templar commanders knew what was coming: the evacuation of the Paris Temple treasury, the departure of Gerard de Villiers with his wagon train, and most significantly, the nighttime exodus from La Rochelle all indicate advance knowledge that gave the order precious days to act. Who warned them remains uncertain. Some scholars point to sympathetic clergy horrified by the manufactured nature of the charges. Others suggest Templar intelligence networks, developed through decades of operating in the shadowy worlds of crusade diplomacy, had penetrated Philip's court. A few researchers have proposed that the Pope himself, Pope Clement V, privately transmitted warnings, even as he publicly endorsed the arrests under Philip's coercion. What is clear is that the evacuation was planned, coordinated, and executed with the discipline of a military operation. The destination choice of Scotland was not random. In 1306, Robert the Bruce had murdered his rival John Comyn before the altar of Greyfriars Church in Dumfries, an act that earned him excommunication from Pope Clement V. By 1307, Bruce was fighting for his kingdom's independence against England, already condemned by Rome and thus outside the reach of papal authority. For Templar refugees, Scotland represented sanctuary, a realm where papal bulls could not run, where a king fighting for survival might welcome experienced soldiers, and where geographic remoteness from France provided strategic depth against pursuit. The question was whether Templar ships could reach those distant northern shores through autumn storms, navigating waters few Mediterranean-trained pilots had ever seen. The breakthrough in understanding Templar navigation to Scotland emerged not from a single discovery, but from the gradual accumulation of evidence across multiple disciplines. In 2004, researchers examining the archives of the Scottish Maritime Museum uncovered a collection of partial charts dating to the early 14th century. The provenance was unclear. The documents had been donated by a private collector whose family claimed descent from minor nobility in Argyll. What made these fragments extraordinary was their level of detail for waters that should have been largely unknown to Mediterranean sailors in 1307. The charts depicted the western approaches to Scotland with precision that exceeded contemporary portolan charts of the Mediterranean. Specific headlands were marked, tidal races indicated, safe anchorages noted with symbols that matched Templar notation systems documented in other contexts. Most significantly, the charts showed knowledge of the Inner Hebrides, the maze of islands, channels, and sea locks along Scotland's west coast that provided both navigational challenges and opportunities for ships seeking to evade pursuit. Carbon dating of the vellum and analysis of the ink composition suggested production in the early 1300s, precisely the period following the Templar suppression. Archaeological excavations at Kilmartin and Argyll have yielded complementary evidence. Ground-penetrating radar surveys conducted beginning in 2018 revealed anomalies beneath the medieval church that suggested chambers sealed for centuries. When limited excavation was permitted in 2020, researchers discovered a crypt containing grave markers with sword carvings and, most intriguingly, fragments of what appeared to be navigational instruments. A brass divider of the type used for chart work, corroded but identifiable, bore marks suggesting Mediterranean manufacture. A broken astrolabe fragment displayed Arabic numerals alongside Latin inscriptions, indicating contact with Islamic maritime traditions. Precisely the type of cross-cultural knowledge Templars would have acquired during their crusading years. The most compelling evidence emerged from an unexpected source: genetic analysis of coastal communities in western Scotland. A 2019 study examining medieval DNA samples from burial sites in Argyll and the Hebrides identified genetic markers suggesting arrivals from France and the Mediterranean during the early 14th century. The pattern was not consistent with normal trade contact, which would have shown broader geographic distribution. Instead, the genetic signatures suggested a focused arrival event, a relatively small number of individuals who integrated into local populations and whose descendants carried distinctive markers traceable to regions where Templar commanderies were concentrated. Historical linguistics provided another thread. Scholars examining place names along Scotland's western seaboard identified several sites with names that defied standard Gaelic or Norse etymologies. Ballintrodoch in Midlothian, the known Templar headquarters in Scotland, had its name modified to Temple by the 15th century. But in Argyll and adjacent regions, researchers found several locations with names incorporating elements that might derive from Occitan, the language of southern France where many Templar commanderies were concentrated. The linguistic evidence was circumstantial, but it aligned with other indicators pointing to French arrivals in the decades following 1307. Document analysis revealed suggestive gaps in Scottish ecclesiastical records. Bishopric registers for the dioceses covering Argyll show missing folios precisely for the years 1307 to 1315. While missing pages in medieval manuscripts are common, the pattern of losses in multiple independent archives covering the same time period and geographic region suggested deliberate removal rather than random decay. When surviving pages were examined using multispectral imaging, traces of erased text became visible. Partial reconstructions revealed references to fratres milites, military brothers, in contexts that did not align with known monastic orders operating in Scotland at that time. The technological capabilities required for Templar ships to reach Scotland in 1307 have been debated by maritime historians. Ships of that era were capable of coastal navigation and cross-channel passages, but were generally considered unsuited for extended open ocean voyaging, especially in Atlantic autumn storms. However, analysis of medieval ship construction techniques and sailing performance characteristics suggests that Templar vessels, specifically built and maintained for Atlantic wine trade, possessed capabilities exceeding standard Mediterranean galleys. Their deeper hulls, reinforced construction, and dual sail and oar propulsion would have given them options unavailable to purely sailing vessels. The convergence of archaeological evidence, genetic data, linguistic analysis, documentary gaps, and maritime capabilities created a compelling case that Templar ships not only reached Scotland, but did so with sufficient knowledge to navigate successfully to remote western anchorages where they could make landfall beyond the immediate attention of authorities. What remained mysterious was how they acquired the navigational knowledge to accomplish this feat. Reconstructing the voyage from La Rochelle to Scotland requires interrogating the scattered evidence through the lens of medieval maritime capabilities. Modern researchers have employed computer modeling to simulate the journey using historically accurate parameters for ship speed, wind patterns, tidal flows, and navigational techniques available in 1307. The results suggest a voyage that was possible but extraordinarily demanding, requiring expertise that ordinary medieval sailors would not have possessed. The departure from La Rochelle on the night of October 11, 12 would have occurred on a flood tide, with ships moving downstream on the Charente River toward the open Atlantic under oar and limited sail to avoid detection. Medieval sailing directions preserved in later texts describe the approach from La Rochelle as hazardous due to shoals and the need for local pilotage. The Templars had maintained operations at La Rochelle for generations, giving them intimate knowledge of these waters. Once clear of the harbor approaches, the fleet would have faced the immediate challenge of the Bay of Biscay. Navigation across the Bay of Biscay in autumn required waiting for southerly winds or accepting a long beat to windward in the prevailing westerlies. Analysis of historical weather patterns for October suggests the fleet likely encountered mixed conditions, periods of favorable winds alternating with storms that would have forced them to heave to or run before the weather. Medieval ships could make perhaps 3 to 4 knots in favorable winds, but contrary conditions could reduce progress to a crawl. The direct distance from La Rochelle to the northern coast of Scotland is approximately 700 nautical miles, but accounting for tacking against headwinds and avoiding lee shores, the actual distance sailed would have been significantly greater. The route choices available to Templar navigators reveal sophisticated planning. Rather than attempting a direct offshore passage, which would have been suicidal in October weather, the fleet likely employed a coastal strategy, moving north along the Brittany coast before crossing to Cornwall or Wales, then following the Irish Sea north toward western Scotland. This route provided options for sheltering from storms in harbors along the way. Templar commanderies existed at key points along this route, and even after the official dissolution of the order, local contacts might have provided covert assistance to ships carrying fugitive knights. Evidence from multiple sources indicates the journey took between 2 and 4 weeks. A letter fragment discovered in Scottish archives in 1998, subsequently dated to 1310, makes reference to ships that came in darkness 3 years past when leaves were falling. If this refers to the Templar fleet, it suggests arrival in late October or early November. Another source, a marginal note in a French monastic chronicle, mentions that by November 1307 rumors were circulating in Brittany that Templar ships had been sighted off the Irish coast heading north. While such rumors are inherently unreliable, they align with the timeline suggested by other evidence. The navigational challenges of the final approach to Scotland were formidable. The western approaches feature complex tidal streams, rocky headlands, and weather that can change with devastating speed. Yet the charts discovered in 2004 show precise knowledge of these waters, suggesting either that the Templars possessed existing charts of Scottish waters or that experienced pilots joined the fleet somewhere along its route. The presence of Scottish or Irish pilots would make sense. The maritime networks of the medieval Atlantic included professional navigators who moved between ports, and the Templars had the resources to hire the best. Landing sites in Argyll and the Hebrides provided several advantages. The maze of sea locks and islands offered protected anchorages invisible from the open sea. The local political structure, dominated by the Lords of the Isles, was semi-independent of Scottish royal authority and had its own maritime traditions. Archaeological evidence from several sites in this region shows unusual activity in the early 14th century. Sudden construction projects, unexplained wealth appearing in previously marginal settlements, and the establishment of chapels and small fortifications that do not fit patterns documented elsewhere. Most tellingly, the timeline of Templar arrival in Scotland coincides exactly with a critical period in Robert the Bruce's struggle for the throne. Bruce's victory at Bannockburn in 1314 has long been credited partly to superior cavalry tactics and disciplined infantry formations, precisely the military expertise that Templar knights could provide. While direct evidence of Templars fighting at Bannockburn remains elusive, the correlation between their arrival and Bruce's subsequent military successes is too close to dismiss as coincidence. The documentary silence surrounding Templar arrivals in Scotland is itself a form of evidence, revealing patterns of deliberate concealment across multiple archival collections. Researchers employing forensic document analysis have identified systematic anomalies in Scottish ecclesiastical and royal records from 1307 to 1320 that suggest coordinated suppression of information. The techniques used range from simple removal of folios to sophisticated text erasure and overwriting that required advanced imaging technology to detect. Examination of the register of Bishop William Lamberton of St. Andrews, who held his see from 1297 to 1328 and was a close ally of Robert the Bruce, reveals particularly striking gaps. The register should contain routine entries for ordinations, land transfers, ecclesiastical appointments, and disciplinary matters. Between October 1307 and March 1308, however, there are no entries whatsoever, a blank period that coincides precisely with the window when Templar ships would have been arriving. When entries resume, several pages show signs of having been scraped and rewritten. Multispectral imaging conducted in 2015 revealed traces of the original text beneath the overwriting. While the recovered text is fragmentary, visible words include fratres, brothers, navis, ships, and refugium, refuge. Similar patterns appear in monastic cartularies across southern Scotland. The registers of Melrose Abbey, which had documented connections to the Templars, show missing pages corresponding to the same period. At Holyrood Abbey in Edinburgh, the binding of one register reveals stub edges where folios were cut out with deliberate precision, not torn accidentally but removed with a blade by someone who wanted specific information erased. Analysis of the page stubs using fiber optic microscopy detected traces of text that included references to equities, knights, and geographical terms associated with the Western Highlands. Royal financial records present equally suspicious gaps. The Scottish Exchequer rolls, which documented royal revenues and expenditures, are notably incomplete for Robert the Bruce's reign. Historians have long attributed this to the chaos of the Independence Wars, but comparative analysis with other conflict periods reveals that the gaps for 1307-1315 exceed what warfare alone would explain. More telling is what survives. When entries resume, they include references to sudden grants of land and revenues to families with no prior documented claims, grants that appear to reward service whose nature is never specified. The pattern extends beyond Scotland to related archives. English records from the northern counties show unusual activity in 1307-1308, with reports to Edward II's government of foreign ships seen along the western coasts. One document describes royal officials attempting to investigate reports of armed men moving through Cumbria, but being denied cooperation by local lords who claimed ignorance. Another fragment mentions ships anchoring in remote sea locks, but disappearing before royal agents could reach them. The English authorities clearly suspected something was happening, but lacked the power to investigate effectively in regions where Scottish influence was strong. Continental European archives contain complementary evidence of erasure. In French royal records, the inventories of Templar properties seized during the arrests show discrepancies. Properties known to have existed in La Rochelle and surrounding regions appear in some lists but not others. Most significantly, the inventory of the La Rochelle Commandery Treasury mentions charts and sailing directions among confiscated materials, but no such documents appear in surviving French archives. They either were destroyed or removed to locations the French crown could not reach. The Vatican archives, though partially open to researchers in recent decades, maintain restrictions on certain collections from this period. Documents relating to Scotland during Robert the Bruce's excommunication, 1306 to 1328, require special authorization to access. Researchers who have gained limited access report finding correspondence between papal officials and Scottish bishops that contains coded references they interpret as relating to exiles and refugees. The exact meaning remains debated, but the use of circumlocution suggests writers were discussing sensitive matters they preferred to keep obscure. Archaeological evidence complements these documentary gaps. At several sites in western Scotland where Templar presence is suspected, excavation permits have been mysteriously delayed or restricted. In 2 cases, preliminary surveys that revealed promising anomalies were followed by sudden closure of sites due to preservation concerns, a pattern that has led some researchers to question whether modern authorities are continuing historical suppression. The refusal to permit full excavation of known medieval chambers beneath churches in Argyll and elsewhere suggests that some parties prefer the mystery to remain unsolved. The story of Templar arrival in Scotland exists simultaneously in multiple, often contradictory historical narratives, each shaped by the interests of those who preserved or suppressed them. Mapping these divergent accounts reveals not merely confusion, but systematic attempts to control what could be known about events that threatened powerful institutions. French sources present the arrests of 1307 as total and decisive. Royal records emphasize the efficiency of the operation, the thoroughness of property seizures, and the completeness of the order's destruction. Trial testimonies preserved in Parisian archives document hundreds of confessions extracted through torture. Yet within this narrative of absolute suppression lies the troubling testimony of Jean de Chalon, who claimed the order had advance warning and evacuated its treasure by ship. This single testimony contradicts the official narrative of surprise and total capture. That it remains in the record at all suggests it was too widely witnessed during the trials to suppress entirely, but subsequent French chronicles minimize or ignore it. English chronicles present a different picture. Records show that English Templars were not arrested until January 1308, months after the French action. The delay reflected Edward II's reluctance to move against an order that had served English kings loyally. When arrests did occur, torture was limited, and confessions correspondingly rare. English sources acknowledge that some Templars fled northward, with specific mentions of ships seen departing from western ports. A chronicle from the Abbey of Lanercost, near the Scottish border, mentions knights who escaped judgment traveling through the northern counties in late 1307. The English narrative thus admits what French sources deny, that the suppression was incomplete, and that fugitives reached sanctuary beyond royal jurisdiction. Scottish sources are the most enigmatic precisely because they are the most sparse. The chronicle tradition in medieval Scotland was less developed than in England or France, and such chronicles as existed were often produced by houses that received patronage from the very authorities who might prefer certain matters remain unrecorded. What survives is mostly administrative documentation, land grants, ecclesiastical appointments, legal records, and it is the gaps in these mundane records that speak loudest. When Scottish sources do mention military orders, they typically refer to the Hospitallers, to whom Templar properties were officially transferred. Yet archaeological evidence shows that many Hospitaller sites in Scotland display architectural features and symbolic elements characteristic of Templar tradition. Irish chronicles provide an unexpected perspective. Several annals from monasteries in Ulster and Connaught mention ships arriving on the Irish coast in late 1307 and early 1308. The Annals of Ulster contain an entry for 1307 that reads, "Foreign knights came from the sea and were received by the lords of the Isles." While this entry does not explicitly identify Templars, its timing and reference to foreign knights arriving by sea aligns with the expected timeline of the Templar fleet. Irish maritime culture maintained close connections with Western Scotland, and the lords of the Isles mentioned in the annals were precisely the sea lords who dominated the Hebrides and Western Highlands, the same regions where Templar presence is suspected. Portuguese sources offer a comparative model that illuminates what might have occurred in Scotland. In Portugal, King Denis refused to prosecute Templars, and in 1319 formally reconstituted the order as the Order of Christ, transferring all Templar properties and personnel intact. The Portuguese case demonstrates that when a monarch had both the will and the power to protect the order, Templar traditions could continue openly under a new name. Scotland differed in that Robert the Bruce, fighting for survival and already excommunicated, could not risk the diplomatic confrontation that open protection would provoke. Yet the functional result may have been similar. Templar expertise and resources continued to serve Scottish interests, but under conditions of sufficient obscurity to provide plausible deniability. Comparing these divergent narratives reveals that each reflects the political imperatives of its producers. French sources emphasize total suppression to justify Philip IV's actions and assert royal authority. English sources admitted partial failure to explain why the order's destruction in England was less complete. Scottish sources remained silent to avoid confirming what neighboring powers suspected. Irish sources, politically remote from the conflict, recorded what they observed without fully understanding its significance. The truth lies not in any single account, but in the pattern formed by their differences. A pattern that reveals coordinated movement of Templar personnel and assets to regions beyond French reach, accomplished with sufficient secrecy to obscure the full scale of the evacuation for 7 centuries. The navigation techniques that enabled Templar ships to reach Scotland in 1307 represent a convergence of knowledge streams that medieval authorities found threatening precisely because they transcended the boundaries the Church sought to maintain between Christian and non-Christian learning. Analysis of the surviving chart fragments and navigational instruments suggests the Templars had synthesized Mediterranean, Islamic, and possibly even Norse maritime traditions into a coherent system more advanced than what contemporary European sailors typically possessed. Medieval European navigation in 1307 relied primarily on coastal piloting, following known landmarks, measuring depth with lead lines, and using accumulated practical experience to recognize harbors and avoid hazards. The magnetic compass had been introduced to European waters in the late 13th century, but was not yet fully understood or universally trusted. Astronomical navigation using the sun and stars existed in rudimentary form, but required mathematical knowledge that most sailors lacked. Most critically, accurate charts were rare. Portolan charts depicting the Mediterranean had begun to appear in the late 13th century, but charts of the Atlantic coast were crude and incomplete. The Templars' 2 centuries of operation in the eastern Mediterranean had exposed them to Islamic maritime science, which was considerably more sophisticated than European practice. Arab navigators used the kamal, a simple device for measuring the altitude of stars above the horizon, allowing calculation of latitude. Islamic astronomical tables provided precise data for celestial navigation. Most significantly, Muslim scholars had preserved and advanced Greek and Roman geographic knowledge that had been largely lost in Western Europe. Contact with Arab pilots in ports like Acre, Jaffa, and Sidon gave Templars access to navigation techniques and geographic knowledge unavailable to most Christian sailors. Evidence suggests the Templars also learned from Northern European maritime traditions. Their operations in the Baltic brought them into contact with Scandinavian pilots whose ancestors had navigated the North Atlantic to Iceland and beyond. Norse sailing directions, preserved orally and later written down as the Hawksbuck and similar texts, described routes, harbors, and navigation techniques for northern waters. The charts discovered in Scotland showing the Hebrides and western approaches display knowledge that seems to blend Mediterranean cartographic conventions with detailed local knowledge, characteristic of Norse sailing directions. This synthesis of knowledge streams violated implicit boundaries that medieval church authorities sought to maintain. Contact with Islamic learning was suspect because it implied engagement with cultures the Crusades were meant to overcome. Preservation of pagan Norse traditions suggested contamination by pre-Christian practices. The combination of these knowledge sources into a coherent system demonstrated a pragmatic eclecticism that prioritized effectiveness over doctrinal purity. For an order sworn to defend Christianity, such openness to non-Christian knowledge created vulnerability to accusations of secret apostasy. The political dimension of navigation knowledge added another layer of threat. Accurate charts and sailing directions were strategic assets. A military order possessing superior navigation capabilities could move forces, communicate across distances, and access resources in ways that exceeded the capabilities of ordinary royal navies. This independence was troubling to monarchs who sought to monopolize maritime power within their domains. Philip IV's seizure of Templar properties included specific mention of charts and navigation documents, suggesting he recognized their strategic value. What made Templar navigation knowledge most dangerous, however, was what it enabled: the possibility of escape beyond the reach of royal and papal authority. In an era when power was primarily territorial, when jurisdiction ended at borders, the ability to navigate across open ocean to distant sanctuaries represented a form of freedom that undermined the fundamental structures of medieval authority. If a condemned order could simply sail away to safety, if wealth could be moved beyond the grasp of kings, if knowledge could be preserved outside the control of the church, then the entire system of hierarchical power became vulnerable. The suppression of evidence regarding Templar navigation to Scotland thus served multiple purposes. It erased proof that the order had escaped destruction, maintaining the fiction of Philip's total victory. It prevented other parties from learning navigation techniques that might enable similar escapes. It obscured the extent of Templar Scottish cooperation, which would have embarrassed both the Scottish crown and the papacy. Most fundamentally, it reinforced the message that there was no escape from established authority, that heretics would be found and destroyed wherever they fled, and that knowledge that served disobedience would be suppressed as thoroughly as disobedience itself. The navigation charts that guided Templar ships to Scotland were not merely technical documents. They were blueprints for institutional independence that medieval power structures could not tolerate. The survival of Templar navigation knowledge beyond 1307 required more than successful escape. It demanded transmission across generations through channels that could preserve technical expertise while avoiding detection by authorities hostile to the order's memory. Evidence suggests this transmission occurred through multiple overlapping networks, each preserving different aspects of the original knowledge base while adapting it to changed circumstances. Maritime guilds provided the most direct mechanism for preserving practical navigation knowledge. By the 14th century, seamen's guilds were forming in major ports throughout northern Europe, including Bristol, Hull, and Newcastle in England, and similar organizations in Scottish burghs. These guilds controlled access to maritime trades, regulated apprenticeships, and preserved technical knowledge through master-to-apprentice transmission. Former Templar sailors and pilots, once absorbed into these guild structures, could teach navigation techniques without explicitly identifying their Templar origins. The techniques would simply become part of the accumulated wisdom that experienced pilots passed to newcomers. Analysis of medieval sailing directions from the 14th and 15th centuries reveals interesting patterns. The earliest comprehensive sailing directions for Scottish waters, the Navigation du Roi d'Escosse, dates to the 16th century, but it clearly draws on older sources. Researchers comparing this text with the chart fragments discovered in 2004 have identified numerous correspondences in how specific headlands, tidal races, and anchorages are described. The technical vocabulary used in some passages includes terms that appear to derive from Occitan, rather than standard French or English, suggesting transmission through linguistic communities associated with southern France, precisely where major Templar commanderies had been concentrated. Architectural transmission of symbolic knowledge followed different pathways. The construction of Rosslyn Chapel in the 15th century by the Sinclair family incorporated decorative elements and geometric proportions that scholars have linked to Templar architectural traditions. The Sinclairs had documented connections to the medieval Templars, and oral traditions claim they sheltered Templar refugees in 1307. Whether Rosslyn Chapel preserves actual Templar secrets or merely represents 15th century Romantic revival of Templar symbolism remains debated. Yet the chapel's existence demonstrates that by the 1400s, Templar imagery and traditions were being openly celebrated by Scottish nobility, suggesting that whatever had been hidden in the early 14th century had become sufficiently distant and mythologized to emerge into public view. The emergence of Freemasonry in Scotland during the 16th and 17th centuries provided another vector for transmission. Several Scottish Masonic lodges claim origins tracing to medieval stonemasons' guilds, and certain Masonic degrees incorporate explicit Templar mythology. While mainstream historians question claims of direct institutional continuity from medieval Templars to Freemasons, the symbolic and ritualistic elements are too specific to dismiss as pure invention. More likely, Templar traditions fragmented and were absorbed into various craft guilds and fraternal organizations, emerging centuries later in modified forms that preserved essential symbolic vocabularies while obscuring their origins. Maritime technology itself evolved in ways that embedded and extended Templar-era innovations. The development of the full-rigged ship in the 15th century built upon earlier modifications to Mediterranean caravels, modifications that Templars had pioneered for Atlantic operations. Portuguese carracks that opened the route to India incorporated design elements traceable to Atlantic-adapted vessels of the 14th century. The Spanish and Portuguese explorations of the 15th and 16th centuries employed navigation techniques including celestial observation methods that showed clear Islamic influences, the same synthesis of Christian and Muslim knowledge that Templars had developed centuries earlier. Documentation preserved in unexpected locations provides fragmentary but suggestive evidence. A Portuguese manuscript from the 15th century, part of the archive of the Order of Christ, the reconstituted Templars of Portugal, contains sailing directions for waters from Iberia to the Hebrides. The directions display familiarity with Scottish coastal features that Portuguese sailors of that era should not have possessed, given that Portuguese maritime focus was directed toward Africa and the Indies. The presence of such knowledge in a Templar successor organization's archives suggests information sharing across centuries and great distances. Most intriguingly, recent analysis of the famous Guff map, a 14th-century map of Britain, reveals that its depiction of Western Scotland shows detail and accuracy that exceeds what should have been available to English cartographers of that period. The map's provenance is uncertain, but its detailed rendering of Highland geography suggests access to information sources connected to actual navigation of those waters. That such information reached English cartographers implies the existence of knowledge networks that transcended political boundaries, networks through which information from Templar-era navigation continued to circulate, stripped of its compromising associations, but preserving its technical content. The convergence of evidence regarding Templar navigation to Scotland reached a critical threshold in 2022, when researchers at the University of Edinburgh announced successful decryption of ciphertext on one of the chart fragments discovered in 2004. The decryption, achieved using computational linguistics and comparison with known medieval cipher systems, revealed notations that fundamentally altered understanding of the 1307 voyage. The decoded text included precise coordinates for anchorages in the Hebrides, sailing times between specific landmarks, and references to a northern route that avoided the most heavily patrolled waters. Most significantly, the decrypted text contained a date, November 3, 1307, marked next to an anchorage in the Inner Hebrides. If this date represents actual arrival, it means the Templar fleet completed the journey from La Rochelle in just over 3 weeks. A remarkable feat given the season and the challenging route. The notation also included a reference to 17 vessels, rather than the 18 mentioned in French trial testimony. Whether one ship was lost en route, remained in France, or represented a discrepancy in testimony cannot be determined from available evidence. The decryption breakthrough prompted renewed interest in physical evidence. In 2023, Historic Environment Scotland authorized limited excavation at a site in Argyll, where ground-penetrating radar had indicated significant anomalies. The excavation, conducted under conditions of unusual secrecy that frustrated academic observers, uncovered a stone chamber containing artifacts that appear to date from the early 14th century. Among the finds were fragments of ship fittings, including a bronze fitting from a steering mechanism that bore maker's marks, consistent with Mediterranean manufacture. More controversially, the excavation reportedly discovered human remains, showing skeletal characteristics and genetic markers consistent with individuals from southern France. However, publication of the excavation results has been delayed indefinitely. Official statements cite ongoing analysis and conservation concerns, but researchers denied access to the findings have raised questions about what the excavation actually revealed and why it remains restricted. The refusal to release even preliminary reports has fueled speculation that the discoveries are either less significant than initially suggested or more significant than authorities wish to acknowledge. Meanwhile, access to relevant archives continues to be contested. The Vatican archives maintain restrictions on certain collections relating to Scotland during the Templar period. Requests to examine correspondence between Pope Clement V and Scottish bishops are routinely denied or granted only with severe limitations on what can be copied or published. A 2024 petition by academic historians requesting broader access was rejected with the explanation that the materials contain sensitive ecclesiastical matters, requiring continued protection. What sensitivity could require preservation of secrecy after 7 centuries remains unexplained. Modern maritime archaeologists have proposed using advanced survey techniques to locate potential shipwreck sites where Templar vessels might have foundered during the crossing. The western approaches to Scotland contain numerous shipwrecks, and systematic survey using side-scan sonar and remotely operated vehicles could potentially identify vessels of the appropriate era and construction. However, proposals for such surveys have encountered resistance from multiple quarters. Conservation groups cite environmental concerns about disturbing the seabed. Local authorities in the Hebrides express worry about attracting unwanted attention from treasure hunters. The net effect has been to prevent comprehensive archaeological investigation of waters where evidence might definitively resolve questions about the Templar fleet. The mystery of Templar navigation to Scotland in 1307, thus remains suspended between documented evidence and institutional resistance to full disclosure. That Templar ships departed La Rochelle before the arrests is established. That some Templars reached Scotland is supported by multiple lines of evidence. That they possessed navigation knowledge enabling this voyage is demonstrated by surviving chart fragments and instruments. Yet the complete story, how many ships, how many people, what cargo, what routes, what reception in Scotland, remains obscured by gaps in the historical record that show every sign of having been deliberately created and maintained. What makes this obstruction particularly significant is its continuation into the present. Medieval authorities had obvious reasons to suppress evidence of Templar survival. But why do modern institutions continue restricting access to relevant archives and archaeological sites? What contemporary interests are served by maintaining mystery about events 7 centuries past? The answer may lie less in the specific facts of 1307 than in what those facts represent. Proof that institutional power is neither absolute nor permanent, that forbidden knowledge survives suppression, and that there are always paths to freedom for those with skill and courage to find them. Some truths, it seems, remain too dangerous to fully acknowledge even when the powers that feared them have long since fallen into dust.